All right, well, good evening and welcome everyone to Episcopal Clergy Compensation, speaking the same language. My name is Brendan Hunter. I'm a program director for leadership resources at the Episcopal Church Foundation. So glad you've taken the time out of your busy schedules this evening to join us for this very important topic. Just want to quickly go over briefly an introduction to the Episcopal Church Foundation. If we could have the next slide. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, ECF is a lay-led and run independent organization that was founded in 1949 by the then presiding bishop, Henry Knox Sherrill. You can see our 4 desired impacts that we have right up on the screen, but our mission is to strengthen the leadership, strategic, and financial capacities of Episcopal congregations, dioceses, and other organizations such as camp and conference centers, charities, or religious organizations. We do this through a variety of programs. If you haven't already, I encourage you to check out our website, episcopalfoundation.org, to learn more about our leadership programs such as Vital Teams, ECF Vital Practices, our Fellowship Partners program, which has the applications open. We do our capital campaigns and strategic services in that area, and as well as financial resources with planned giving, endowment management, and a variety of other services as well. So, also want to cover just a couple of quick notes as well, that this webinar is also made possible through a grant that the Episcopal Church Foundation received through the Lilly Endowment rather. And ECF received a 3-year grant as part of Lilly Endowment's national initiative to address the economic challenges facing pastoral leaders. ECF's grant is entitled From Economic Challenges to Transformational Opportunities, and this will provide lay and clergy leaders of the Episcopal Church with resources, tools, and other support to help address financial leadership challenges of congregational ministry in the 21st century. So if you would like to know more about ECF's Lilly Endowment Initiative, you can also go check that out on our website. Quick few technical notes. As people know, you're on mute. I'd encourage you to open up the chat box so you can ask questions, and we'll also be having some poll questions throughout this. We are here for you, so do take advantage of the chat box throughout this evening's webinar. And one last note, though, is that this webinar is being recorded and broadcast live over Facebook, so do keep that in mind. If you do have any questions or comments that might be somewhat more confidential, we're always happy to take those questions or comments offline. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Nancy and John.
Thank you. Well, welcome to our presentation tonight, and thank you for being here. My name is Nancy Fritchner. I am a CPA licensed in Kentucky, and currently answer the clergy tax line for the church pension group. I have previously been on Credo teams as finance faculty. I am retiring from my tax practice, but I've worked for over 30 years in tax, primarily in tax and primarily clergy tax. My co-presenter here is John, and he is my husband, and I will let him introduce himself now.
So I've been ordained this past week, 32 years. I spent 3 years as an assistant at a rather large church, then as a rector of what I would call at the time a small church for 7 years. Average Sunday attendance of about 100, and then I finished the last 17 years at a church with average Sunday attendance of about 275. Done some things, been on committees, been to General Convention 4 times, but I wouldn't trade anything for being an Episcopal priest. I've just had a great time. Also, I guess I've done 2 interim ministries. So I've sort of been almost every church environment.
Thank you. So we want to start this evening, give you a little overview of our presentation. We hope to discuss the misunderstandings between clergy and lay leaders over the term compensation. And we'll talk about issues surrounding that, about presentation issues in financial reports and in talking to your congregations. And our goal is to provide a way for clergy and lay to speak the same language or to have the same meaning when they use the term compensation. So let's get started talking about how you determine what to pay your clergy. In doing some research, I ran across a reference book called Church Finance, The Complete Guide to Managing Ministry Resources by Michael Batts and Richard Hammer. In the book, they talk about a concept they call compensation philosophy. And what they mean is, with compensation philosophy, is how compensation of a staff compares with compensation of staff at a comparable church. The idea is then you want to determine what your philosophy is. Do you want it to be the same, a percentage of, higher than, lower than what a comparable position is in other churches? And we've got a link at the end of our presentation. We've got a reference at the end of our presentation to the compensation report that you can find at the 2016 Church Compensation Report. So there's a reference for you to look. But in any event, the idea is determining how much you want to pay your clergy and basing it on what the comparable churches are paying. And also you need to consider their education level. You would want to consider the fact that a seminary education is an advanced degree. You also want to look at experience and, of course, skills. And different clergy bring skills perhaps from secular work they've done before. So the whole idea is to come up with a plan so that you don't just pull a number out of the air as far as what you want to pay your clergy. We have to also keep in mind that the model of a cleric with a 3-year seminary degree and 30 years of full-time service is changing in the Episcopal Church, and there are going to be more part-time positions, bivocational clergy, and so it becomes even more important, I think, to have a plan about how you want to establish pay for those types of clergy as you're hiring them. So what do we mean when we talk about compensation? I think from the vestry's perspective, compensation of a cleric is thought of as the total package. How much does it cost us to have a priest? And total costs include, besides pay, things like health insurance, the pension assessment, continuing education, travel, other business expenses. So I think when the vestry speaks about compensation, they're looking at the whole picture of what it costs to have a cleric. But from the clergy's perspective, they're looking primarily at salary. How much am I going to be paid? What will be deposited to my checking account? Now, the benefits are important, but the focus when you're talking to clergy, when you say this is what your compensation is going to be, the focus is how much am I being paid? So I'm going to let John tell you a little story about his experience with developing a compensation plan. And so I'll let you take it away.
And, I think this is, I'm just sitting here thinking, this conversation, I think, is really timely because I think this is a time of year when finance committees are getting together to talk about what we're going to put in our budget and how much are we going to pay our staff, or are there going to be any raises? I'm just going to throw out, this is not part of my story, but I want to say that at this time of year, I want to tell you what your clergy are thinking, or at least your rector is thinking. And they're thinking, well, I hope I've done a good job with the stewardship campaign because my salary depends on it. And I often felt as if I didn't raise a lot of money in the church, then I wasn't going to get a raise. And, to do that for 2 or 3 months every year, I think puts a lot of pressure on the priests. But just to tell you, again, we're talking about trying to present both sides of the compensation story. So I was called to a church that wanted to build a new nave worship space, and that was their goal. So when I arrived, we broke ground about 10 months, 12 months after I arrived. We had just had a capital campaign. So we moved into the new church. The building was built. We moved into the new church, and things went along for 2 or 3 years. All the while, I sort of felt like I was not being paid to at least the average of parishes our size. So I asked the canon for finance to please give me, without names, the churches, the 7 churches that were in sort of our average Sunday attendance and budget categories, so that I could sort of present this and also for myself make a comparison. So what I found out was that out of the 7 churches, again, I didn't know their names. I didn't know the names of the churches, but I was, out of 7, I was number 7. And
As far as your compensation?
As far as my compensation compared to the other priests or compared to the other churches. So I thought, well, I've done everything they've asked me to do. I built a new church. I raised the money for it. And I'm getting a 1% raise to my salary every year. And in addition, I was at the bottom. So I went to my finance committee and said, here's where I am. Now, if you think that I'm much below average, should be at the bottom, you've been successful. If you think that I should be in the middle, that I'm an average priest compared to the other priests in the other churches, then this is where we need to go. And then if you think I'm better than average, you're glad that I'm here and you don't want me to leave because of money, then this is where we need to go. And I think it was eye-opening for everybody. I have to say, I've had huge compliments to them. They said about a 4-year plan to raise my salary to be at the top of the list rather than where it was at the bottom. So that's my compensation story. So we have a question for you. And the question is, do you or does your church or does your finance committee have a compensation plan? So just, this is a yes or no, or it's a not sure, but or is it kind of gray as you enter into the budgetary process?
And for those of us joining on Facebook Live, if you want to chime in the comments as well, I can add your tallies into the total for those participating in the webinar.
So I think the point is that the plan, without a plan, you end up at not necessarily where you want to be. Well, here we've got our results, and it says that 100% have a clergy compensation plan, so that's fantastic.
Yay.
Thank you.
Yay.
Yay. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the package from the vestry's perspective. What might be in a cleric's package? Well, salary, again, this would be the cash they receive plus their housing. And we're going to discuss in more detail the definition of salary on the next slide. And we have some slides on housing. But for right now, let's just think of salary as cash plus housing. Health insurance is often a part of a cleric's package. They don't receive the cash, but it is a benefit. And we're, again, going to have another slide on health insurance. The church pension fund assessments is part of the package. And this is currently at 18% of compensation, and we're going to address that a little bit later as well. Other things that are sometimes in a package, or often in a package, is a continuing education for the cleric, typically some line item for that. In addition, reimbursed business expense and travel. And there could be other things like tuition for children to church-sponsored schools, a housing equity allowance for clergy living in a rectory, and that's different from a housing allowance. Housing equity allowance are funds that are set apart, and we're going to go into that a little bit detail later. I'm sure there's others, perhaps a membership in a club. And if you'd like to list others, we can discuss them, but I think you see my point. There are often lots of things that a parish might do for their rector, all considered part of the package, all of what it costs to employ a minister. So from the clergy's perspective, from the vestry's perspective, we tend to look at the clergy, cost of having a clergy as the whole cost, all the things associated with that. Now the salary, what is a salary for clergy? Well, it is a cash stipend, and often it is what we refer to as a SECA tax reimbursement. That's Social Security and Medicare tax for clergy, and housing, whether that's housing allowance or money paid to the cleric to provide their own housing, or whether it's the church that's providing the house or a rectory. All that's what I consider when we say the word salary. So the question is this: do the terms compensation and salary mean the same thing, or are they different? And again, are the terms used in the letter of agreement and in the budget consistent with that meaning? The point is, we want to try to be as clear as we possibly can be. Does the church pension fund have a different meaning when they use the word compensation? Again, we're going to discuss a little bit more of this in detail, but we have another question for you. Do you think it's clear among the leadership of your parish what it means when you say compensation? Again, thinking about, do you think the leadership thinks in terms of the package, or do they think in terms of salary? Is it clear? Okay, so we're 25% said yes, 25% said no, and 50% said not sure. So we've got a little space in here for things to talk about. That's great. Thank you.
So I'm just going to jump in here and say, my hunch is if people aren't sure, then it's not clear. I don't want to speak for people answering the question, but so I'll just tag that.
Okay, thank you. Now let's take a look at housing. Housing is typically provided to clergy in one of two ways: either a paid housing allowance, or in church-provided housing, or in the Episcopal Church, it's often called a rectory. And we're going to look at each of these. So the first scenario is a paid housing allowance. In this situation, the cleric owns or rents their own home. An allowance is paid directly to them and is often included in the total salary figure that we talked about. And then the cleric determines how much they want the designated housing amount to be. The designation is made by vestry, a resolution every year, and it's recommended they do it either in November or December. If you haven't done it yet, if you're on the vestry, be sure you get a housing allowance designation resolution passed in December, because it's only effective going forward. You cannot go backwards. In other words, if you don't get the housing allowance resolution passed until January, your cleric may not have the benefit of that exclusion for January. And a cash designated as housing is taxable for SECA or self-employment and Social Security tax purposes. So the cleric has to pay self-employment tax on the housing. In our second scenario, this would be a situation where they're living in a rectory or the church is providing the housing. Often it's a house that's owned by the parish, but it could be a situation where the parish is renting an apartment or a house for the cleric. They're providing the house. Since the cleric doesn't have to pay rent, this is still considered a benefit to them and adds to what is considered their salary. So it's, again, the value of this rent-free or living free in a house is considered part of their salary. And it's also part of the pension assessment. Now, often when a cleric lives in a rectory, there is what's called a housing equity allowance. This is an account that's set up often in a retirement account, but it has to be deposited to a third party, not paid to the cleric. And it's an attempt to help the cleric accumulate funds that can be used to purchase a house, a home, when they're no longer living in a rectory. The name housing equity implies that it is similar to equity that you would accumulate in a home that you owned. Again, the value of this rectory or providing the rectory to the cleric is subject to self-employment and Medicare tax, self-employment tax, which is Social Security and Medicare tax. And that value is based on what the house could rent for in the open market. This is an important distinction for tax purposes, is different from pension purposes. Our next slide has to do with health insurance. Now, health insurance is part of the package often offered to clergy, and it can be an expensive part of the package, which I'm sure you all have experienced. But it's not considered part of their salary. Just like in the secular world, health insurance is considered a benefit. Now, at the 2009 General Convention, Resolution A-177 was passed that required participation in the denominational health plan if an employee works for more than 1,500 hours a year, and that's slightly less than 30 hours a week. Most congregations provide coverage for family, but some only provide single coverage for the employee or the cleric. And we may be moving more in this direction, especially with bivocational clergy or part-time clergy. And it's possible that clergy could get their insurance, health insurance, through their spouse or through other work. But for our purposes now, we're just thinking about the expense to the parish, the fact that this is a benefit, and that it is required by this resolution that was passed at General Convention. It's important, I think, for the financial statements to clearly reflect this cost. So I think it's a good practice to state the cost of the health insurance separately from the cleric's salary.
So I'm just going to interrupt and say, I think this is often, I don't know if it's misunderstood or just, I don't know. I think the average person in the pew often thinks when you add salary and housing and health insurance, the pension assessment, and I'll be the first to admit that often that seems like it often is a lot of money, but that's simply what it costs. And I think a lot of people say, we're going to go to a slide in a few minutes that has an example of a cleric making what, about $60,000. If you paid attention to 60, that's one thing, but if you go down, drop down and add everything together, it's going to be 90. And so I can see why the average parishioner would say, oh my gosh, we're paying somebody $90,000. Well, no. And I think we're not paying them 90, we're paying them 60, but they come away with this idea that, oh my gosh, we are overpaying the rector of this parish. that's why we're doing this webinar, to sort of reinforce the idea of being clear about compensation.
And I don't know if would you like to tell your story about health insurance?
Well, yeah, I'll tell my story. So it had to do really with the full package. The example I just used, I was getting paid more than $60,000, but in a vestry meeting one night, a vestry member said, "We can't pay you this much. It costs way too much." And that is because the person was referring to housing, my salary, my pension, and travel, and health insurance. And health insurance is expensive. We all know that. I was pretty clear with her, as I was with the vestry at other times, and I said, "You know what? You don't have to do that. You don't have to pay health insurance. But if you decide to do that, what you're going to have to do is go down there to the street and take Episcopal out from under the sign, because the Episcopal Church, as we mentioned earlier, mandates that we pay health insurance. Now, do we all like how much it costs? No, but that's what we agree to do when we're Episcopalians."
Okay, thank you. All right, let's look at the pension fund assessment. Now, the clergy pension is a defined benefit plan, and that means the benefit the cleric will receive is calculated on a formula. A defined contribution plan, where most lay people now have retirement plans, but a defined contribution plan is where there is an amount that will be received is the amount in the individual's account. So in a defined benefit plan, the payments go into a pool, and the benefit the clergy is going to receive is based on a calculation. In a defined contribution plan, the money goes into the account for the person. And I think that's important to remember.
So I'm just going to interrupt for the lay people out there who are not as adept at tax issues and finances as Nancy is, because I'm not either. What I understand this to mean is there is an 18% assessment on the salary and housing. That does not go into a separate account under Joe Priest, and that when he retires, or he or she, Josephine Priest, they get 18% of their salary times the number of years. So that 18% is high, but it doesn't go to the clergy don't get that when they retire. It goes into a pool.
And then there's the pension amount that is received is based on a calculation. So what is compensation? How is compensation defined by the Church Pension Fund? This definition will be as of January 1st, 2018. Compensation is a base salary excluding housing and scheduled taxable cash payments, such as SECA tax or self-employment tax, if that is reimbursed to the cleric. It is also add cash housing allowance and or utilities where the church pays the utilities, plus any employer contributions to a qualified or non-qualified plan, such as a 403B, which is a defined contribution plan, like the plan the pension fund has, which is called RSVP, plus any one-time payments like a Christmas bonus, and then the value of the employer-provided housing, which is based on a calculation. And I'm not going to go into detail there, but I want you to know that it is based on, if your cleric is living in a rectory, the value of that for pension assessment purposes is based on a calculation It is not the same as the value that is established for tax purposes. So I just want to make that clear, and I would highly recommend that you go to the cpg.org that we've got referenced on this page, and look under the new plan, and you can see the specifics on how to calculate the how the pension is, what compensation is for pension purposes. And I also know there's going to be a new booklet coming out about the pension soon with all the new changes in it. So you might also wonder about this 18%. And I also wanted to point out, as John said, this goes into a pool, and what the priest receives is not the amount that's accumulated in the pool. It's based, again, on a calculation. But the pension also, this assessment also provides, in addition to the pension, it provides short-term and long-term disability. It provides life insurance both when the cleric is active and when they are retired. It provides a survivor benefit, and it provides benefit for dependent children. And in addition, there are clergy in the Episcopal Church who are paid very little, but have provided much needed ministry to our church. And the fact that this money is pooled and the 18% helps those clergy get a pension benefit. So if there are questions about the pension, we'd like for you to send them in, if you would, now, and we'll perhaps have a little bit of time to address those.
So again, would invite everyone to put in your questions. If you are participating in the webinar, that would be through the chat box. If you haven't done so already, that is available on the upper left-hand side of your screen. Press the chat button. That'll open up a box, and you can type your questions in. Also, for those of you who are joining over Facebook, go ahead and type those into the comments, and I will relay those to our presenters. And if we don't get around to your questions right away, or if you think of something as we continue on, I'll monitor the chat box to ensure that your questions are answered.
Yeah. Should we go ahead?
Sure, let's go ahead and press on. If we do get some questions, we may take another pause, but let's go ahead and move for now.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some other items that affecting the package. The clergy can choose to make a contribution from their salary to a 403B plan. Again, this is what I talked about, the contribution plan. Like it's a 403B is like a 401k, except it's just for nonprofits. The limit for 2017 is $18,000, and for 2018, the limit is $18,500 that a clergy can have taken out of their salary and paid into a 403B plan. There's also a catch-up provision, which is $6,000 both this year and next year if you're 50 or older, or if the cleric's 50 or older. These contributions out of their salaries are not taxable for federal income tax purposes, and they are not taxable for Social Security and Medicare purposes or SECA tax. So they are excluded from SECA tax. The church can also contribute, and the total contribution from the church and the amount that's withheld from the cleric's salary has a limit in 2017 of $60,000 and a limit in 2018 of $60,500. Travel is often paid for a cleric for their business miles. Now, if the cleric is paid a flat amount or an allowance, and no accounting is required for that amount of money to be received, then the amount is considered taxable to the cleric. If the cleric is required to document their travel, then the amount that they are reimbursed is based on a standard rate, then this is not considered taxable. So it's often better to do the reimbursement And that's what's called a reimbursement, accountable reimbursement plan. They have to turn in receipts or documentation, and then they get reimbursed for their business expenses or their travel. That's an accountable reimbursement plan. And there could be other items that affect the package. Some we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. One in particular, tuition for children to church-provided schools. I just want to throw this in. I hope I don't get too much tax thrown at you all, but it should be considered taxable to the cleric if they are not an employee of the school. So if you have a clergy person who gets free tuition for their kids to go to a church school, if the cleric is not employed by the school, then that is a taxable benefit, and they need to be made aware of those consequences. If there's other things you would like to add to this list, again, just put them in the chat box, and we'll address some of these at the end of the presentation.
And Nancy, we had a question come up on Facebook. This is backing up slightly to our previous slides on the pension assessment, but Susanna asks, is HAC only the last 7 years or any 7 years where the highest annual compensation is found? And I suppose we should also define HAC for those who don't know what that is.
HAC is highest average compensation, and there are new rules going into effect on January 1 of 2018. And I will state what I believe to be is the case. And I know Janet Todd is with us. If you would type in if I get this incorrectly. But I do believe that it is now, starting in 2018, it's the highest 7, not necessarily consecutive. The highest 7 12-month periods, not necessarily consecutive. So if, again, Janet, I'd appreciate a little help on that if that's not correct. Again, with questions on what the new plan will look like, I encourage you to go to cpg.org, and there's some fabulous fact sheets available for all of these different questions under the new plan.
And Janet has verified in the chat box that that is correct, that the change is that the HAC is for the 7 years for the highest annual compensation is found. So it doesn't have to be consecutive as of next year.
Okay, we're going to move on to the budget. The budget and financial statements should reflect expenses with clarity. And this is this is the way I feel about financial statements. They need to report information so that the reader has enough information to make informed decisions. So the goal of a financial statement is to give the reader sufficient information to make informed or accurate decisions. So the question then is, how do we reflect the amount we pay the cleric in a way that is clear? How do we reflect the package and the way that we are paying the cleric in a way that is clear? And we've got 2 examples, and we're going to look at each one of these. In the first example, the budget seems to be summarized, and it's a summary of the activity of the parish, and it seems fairly easy to understand. In this example, we can see clearly that revenues are not enough to cover expenses. But what I want to take a look at in this example, and this is an actual example I found on the web, is this category called clergy. In this budget, it seems to imply that the clergy is being paid $90,924. But in reality, this $90,924 is the total package and includes health insurance, pension assessment, and other benefits. But that's not clear to the congregation from this statement, I don't think.
And I think this goes back to the example I was giving where somebody says, oh my gosh, we're paying the clergy $90,000 and that's what they're taking home. We start out in the premise of this webinar talking about, what does the clergy, what does the rector or the vicar take home versus, we're trying to understand clergy compensation. So we're going to show you example number 2 where we think it's a bit clearer.
So in this example, you'll notice that we've broken it all out, and we begin with wages of $61,770. I don't know. Can you all see all the numbers? I have a little box over that's got our pictures over some of the numbers. So I hope you can see the numbers. But the salary, including the housing allowance of $61,770, a half SECA tax reimbursement of $5,117 to come to total wages of $66,887. And then the benefits broken out: health insurance, $10,997, pension assessment, $12,040, continuing education, $1,000. So the benefits total $24,000 and coming to the total of $90,924. So I think this is important because there's a big difference between saying your salary is $61,770 and saying the clergy amount is $90,924. So I think you'll probably agree with me that this is a clearer presentation of what is being paid to the cleric. Now we've got
we have a question.
Another little pop-up question, and we want you to be very honest. Do you think your church's budget clearly reflects the clergy package?
Can I tell that story about Charlie?
Yes.
Okay.
Tell it now.
Tell it now.
Another story.
Another story. So speaking of being clear about how much clergy make, what their salary is versus what their package is. We had a family discussion one night at dinner, and our oldest child wanted to know how much I made. Well, like a lot of, just Episcopalians, like a lot of parents, and a lot of people are uncomfortable talking to their children about money. And we've since loosened up a lot about that. And they've also gotten older. But we said, well, we don't really talk about that, And, no, Dad, I want to know. So anyway, a month passes, and we're at dinner another night, said, Dad, I know how much you make. And I said, oh, do you? How much? And so he had gone out during the passing of the peace to go to the bathroom and noticed that the church budget was on the bulletin board. Well, our church budget was clear. And that's sort of the point of the story. It had rector's salary, and it had housing, and it had all these other things. So he looked up at my salary, and he knew how much I was making. So it was clear to a 12-year-old, so maybe it needs to be that clear to everybody.
So it looks like we have 50 that say yes and 50% that say they're not sure.
And we actually got 2 more votes in from Facebook to break that tie in favor of yes.
Oh, good.
Great.
Well, great. Fantastic.
Great. Excellent.
Okay, I want to just do a quick explanation of the SECA tax reimbursement because that is not something that is that every parish does. There we go. So this is just a little quick explanation of clergy compensation and taxes. Clergy are taxed as self-employed for Social Security and Medicare tax purposes. They're considered employees for federal income tax purposes, but self-employed for Social Security and Medicare tax, which means that they are responsible for paying 15.3% for Social Security and Medicare on their total salary. So in our example, Polly is our lay person, And on her salary, only half of that, 7.65%, is withheld from her salary. And her employer pays the other half. So this SECA tax reimbursement is an attempt to level the playing field, if you will, so that the cleric gets some help in paying that 15.3%, which the church would have to pay if this was a layperson. And you'll notice that in the end, the amounts are about the same. Okay, moving on. We would like to wrap up our presentation. Today we've talked about the differences between the cleric's compensation and the package, and we've talked about how to communicate with the vestry and to the congregation. So we have a few next steps we'd like to suggest. And some of you may find these more helpful than others, but we're going to offer them to you. Number one would be to review or develop a compensation plan. How to determine what to pay your clergy, how to determine what to pay all your employees.
I'm going to jump in and suggest, I never had this in my 30 years and I was director 25 years. And we were kind of moving towards this when I retired, but what I would have loved to have seen is the vestry, the finance committee, or whomever have a way to, as Nancy said, designate a salary on an ongoing basis. Not, as I said at the very beginning, not wrapped up in how much money is brought in the stewardship campaign. So an example of that might be we will pay the clergy, their salary will be based on, this base salary, whatever you start with, and then they would get cost of living raises, and then if you want to determine 2% a year, a raise, or whatever. I just think being able to take that yearly stewardship campaign off the table, from my point of view, I think from the cleric's point of view, is really, really beneficial.
Okay. So again, review your plan or create a plan, develop a plan, review your budget and how it is communicated to the congregation to make sure that it is communicated clearly. Invite the clergy to have a conversation about the terms compensation and package. And fourth, include and inform new vestry members on your compensation philosophy and on the terminology. Now we'd like to take questions. The next couple of slides do have references and contact information, but we'd like to open the floor now to questions.
So again, invite everyone in participating in the webinar to put your questions or comments into the chat box. And those of you who are joining us over Facebook Live can go ahead and type those into the comment section, and I can relay those over to our presenters. Susan on Facebook made a comment and stated that a budget like number 2, I believe sample budget number 2, can be a teaching moment for congregation and clergy. Many people do not understand how much their employer pays for benefits.
Agreed. That's a great comment, Susan. And I do think it all needs to be clear. And as John said, the fact that it is expensive, does cost a lot for health insurance, and the pension assessments are considered high. It's important that they understand also, particularly about the pension assessments. I think that's not an amount that's going into an account for the cleric. Again, to go back to the pension slide and to talk and make it clear that this goes into a pool and is providing additional benefits besides pension.
And I'm going to add, I know that my bias is coming out as a rector. I want to say that sometimes rectors are guilty of not being transparent themselves, and that they will hide they will hide their salary in under the one line, staff salaries. And so nobody knows what anybody makes. And so I think, transparency is used a lot these days, but I think in this case, it's really, really helpful that people understand.
And I would just throw in, having come from a congregational background myself, and having my last job was director of administration for a congregation before coming to the Episcopal Church Foundation, that for all staff, then that was the practice at the parish that I was at, for lay and clergy. And so all of our salaries and as well as our benefits were very clearly laid out for anyone in the parish could access that at any point. And that it's a really good practice for all staff, and just it doesn't make it an issue, which can get really, really thorny. Finances can get so thorny in so many instances in congregational life.
Right.
Well, again, we'll continue to invite anybody, if anybody has any questions or comments, to put those in if this made sense. If there are any sticking points that people, I guess, Nancy, I would be curious to know what is sort of like one of the top questions that you usually get. Like, it's tax time, people are trying to figure this out, and they don't know what to do, and they get on the phone and call you up.
Well, from a lay leadership bookkeeper point of view, it's primarily about what gets included in compensation or in wages on the W-2, or how to prepare the W-2. From the clergy standpoint, it's more about what do I have to pay tax on, and how can I get out of it? No, but a lot of confusion around the self-employment tax issues, and I think that's one reason why I wanted to put that slide in there, to help people realize that clergy are not getting a big break on their taxes, because they get this SECA tax reimbursement. It is because they have to pay both parts of self-employment tax, or Social Security and Medicare.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And could you just say a little more about some of these resources that you have up on the screen right now?
So the first two resources, Federal Reporting Requirements for Episcopal Churches and the Clergy Tax Guide, are currently being updated and will be available soon. But the Federal Reporting Requirements for Episcopal Churches is a guide that helps bookkeepers, treasurers, vestry members to understand more about the reporting requirements as far as taxes. So W-2s, 941s, those types of things. A lot of information in there also about clergy taxes, but it's not just about clergy tax. It also is about lay, how to prepare W-2s, and so I highly recommend that. The Clergy Tax Guide is primarily about how to prepare your tax return if you're clergy. But both of these documents have good information in them that might be helpful in providing a guide for offering your clergy certain benefits, or certain taxable, housing allowances. How to set up a housing allowance is in there in both of them. But the Clergy Tax Guide has actual examples of tax returns that clergy would file. The 2016 Church Compensation Report, again, is something you might want to use. It will show province and its analysis of the clergy compensation by church size and things like that. So that might be very helpful in trying to determine a compensation philosophy. And these all are available at cpg.org under Forms and Publications.
And this is wonderful. If Say I was the flustered treasurer who just is starting out and it just does not know where to start, or the clergy person who has a new treasurer that seems to be a little in over their heads with this. Is there one particular place that you would recommend starting off with?
Yes, I'd start with the federal reporting requirements for Episcopal churches. And in that document at the back, would be for preparing W-2s. At the back of that document is a copy of a W-2 and a legend that says what should go in each box of the W-2. And I think that's very helpful. And but that's where I would start if I was a new treasurer or bookkeeper, and or if the cleric wanted to recommend, I'd send them to the federal reporting requirements. And I do that quite often if I get a call on that.
Wonderful, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, thank you, John and Nancy, for this wonderful presentation this evening. It was just a wealth of great information. On your screen right now, you have their contact information. They welcome your questions. If you have other questions that come up afterwards, please feel free to be in touch. Also, please be in touch with us at the Episcopal Church Foundation. We're always happy to answer your questions, but when it comes to clergy compensation and taxes, we'll refer you over to Nancy and John, though. But for other matters like capital campaigns, endowments, with leadership vestry questions, we are very happy to answer those for you. And you can see that our contact information for ECF is up on the slide right now. And one final request for you. In your inbox in a few short minutes at 8 o'clock this evening, there will be an email appearing for those of you who registered for this webinar. And I just encourage you to take a few minutes to click on that link and to provide your feedback. We will be sharing this with Nancy and John, and we also use all of your feedback to plan our webinars and question and answer chat sessions throughout the year. So your feedback is invaluable and very much appreciated. So again, thank you, Nancy and John, for taking the time to put together this great presentation. Thank you to everyone who took the time out of their schedules to attend this evening. We'll be sending out a follow-up email very soon. God bless, Godspeed in your ministries, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
And yes, we'd like to thank you all too. And thank you, Brandon, for helping us tonight. And again, we're willing and able and
feel free
wanting
to contact
us. To answer any questions you might have. Thanks again for your attention.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.